I definitely think there's an audience for A Boy Called Christmas. I didn't really enjoy it personally, but I think that's more down to personal preference. I love Christmas films, but this more fantasy approach just was not something that really appealed to me. Nevertheless, I can definitely see some real positives in this film, and it has some really great messages as well. This was released in 2021. It's directed by Gil Kenan and stars Henry Lawfull as Nikolas, and this is actually the origin story of Santa Claus. But it's not just about that, it's also about grief. We have various characters who are dealing with their own grief, and we also have the true meaning of giving. So, absolutely, we have some really lovely messages, and we have a great narrative structure as well. It's actually initially about some young children who are grieving the loss of their mother, and their aunt, played by Maggie Smith, tells them this story of Nikolas. And pretty much all of the film is the story of Nikolas. It does occasionally cut back to Aunt Ruth and the other children, not so frequently that it feels disorienting, but not so infrequently that I forgot about the narrative structure. So I think they got the balance there really well. And Nikolas goes off on this journey, and he's trying to find his father, and on the way he encounters various people. And I don't want to go into too much detail. I don't want to spoil how he comes about being what we then know is Father Christmas. But it's certainly a well-written narrative. I think it has a lot to offer. There's a lot of substance. There are a lot of great characters. The performances are really great. We have Jim Broadbent as the king, who was a rather interesting character. And I honestly can't find fault with it. I think it is mostly just down to me not liking this kind of story. The Christmas aspect, absolutely, and the messages are beautiful and really important. But as I said, I'm not a huge fan of more fantasy-based films. There are exceptions, of course, and I will always give them a go, as I did with this one. But for me, I just wasn't loving it. But there's nothing specific with the film that caused that. Purely personal preference. Visually, it's beautiful, it's really well done. We have a lot of snowy scenes, of course. It definitely has a strong air of magic. Throughout it, everything did just feel magical, and I think they did a great job with that. I love the costumes. I think the costumes are fantastic. There's a little mouse, and there's a reindeer, and they all look wonderful. So, visually, it's brilliant. The narrative structure is great. The story is well written. The pacing is really good. And the characters are either likable or well written with some really solid performances behind them. So I have no complaints. If, like me, you're not a huge fan of fantasy, then you might not love it. But at the same time, I'd say it's maybe worth checking out, particularly if you're a fan of Christmas films, because it is an interesting concept, and I do think it worked really well. If you love fantasy films, and in particular Christmas films, with a fantasy element, then I think you'll love it. I think you'll really thoroughly enjoy it. So, a really good film when I view it as objectively as possible. When it comes to personal preference, I didn't completely adore it, but it's not the film's fault. That one's purely down to me. I actually think it's a very strong film with some great messages, a well-written narrative, some really likeable, very well-written characters and brilliant performances across the board. A Boy Called Christmas is definitely not a bad film.